Once again, you're going to see a number of living models wearing authentic period clothes from the Museum of Costume at Edge Castle near Tunbridge Wells, illustrating some ideas about the unwritten laws of dress. This is a hat, and this is a hat. There seems to be a certain slightly crazy streak in most fashions. We notice it quite clearly in clothes that have gone out of date, but in each generation only a handful of people who are seldom very popular can see just how irrational they and their contemporaries are. It's easy for us to see, for instance, that there's something a trifle unreasonable about a feminine outline like this, or a masculine hairstyle like that. We can laugh at the hobble skirt of 1911 without noticing that there's anything inconvenient about our own clothes. Although in the first 6 years of the 1950s, a short tight skirt had very little more to be said for it than a long one. Women whose heads were shadowed by huge hats like this 1911 model laugh at women who wear theirs perched on the top of their heads, as in the 1890s, and women who wear their hats on the top of their heads think that a hat on the back of the head is comical. The date of this one is 1878. But to anyone who never wore a hat at all three would appear equally demented. Here is an ultra-smart shoe of the 1940s. It has a platform sole. This was the last word in the 1920s, the shoe with a long, narrow look. And this is the elegant boot of 1910 or 1911, made of patent leather with suede tops. None of it looks very sensible today, the fashionable footwear of the fairly recent past, but we're probably wearing something equally unlike the human foot in shape without even pausing to notice it. Shoes aren't often designed quite so irresponsibly as hats, however, because we have to put our feet to a good deal of use, which isn't always the case with our heads. The beauty of these creations is mysterious and fleeting. Their charm was that they were fashionable, and they were fashionable because, yes, because there was so much nonsense about them. Now, what is the nature of this nonsense, and why is it linked up with fashion? Let's look at some masculine forms of it first. The vogue for ruffles, which began in the 17th century and lasted a long way into the 18th, was brought in by men, and women copied it from them. What has it in common with this, the high starched neckcloth which came in at the end of the 18th century when ruffles had finally gone out? And what have ruffles or starched neckcloths in common with the fashion of 100 years later, this? What they've got in common, as you've doubtless observed, is that they're all strikingly unsuitable for any kind of work that requires physical activity. Outside of the drawing room, and sometimes even in it, ruffles were a nuisance. They were meant to be. They advertised that the wearer was a man of leisure. Kid gloves in very light shades were worn by gentlemen throughout the 19th century, and white ones were still constantly in use until recent times. They were another discreet way of informing people that the wearer didn't have to work, at least with his hands. The snow-white shirt front, starched stiff as a board, was anything but utilitarian. The collar was a development of the neckcloth we've just seen. And that was one more way of making oneself uncomfortable in the great cause of showing that one didn't have to earn one's bread. Of course, the stories told by our clothes may be tall stories. This may be a banker or a lawyer. This man a professional musician. And this one, a painter or an engineer. Fashions are often imitated by those who live quite the wrong lives for them. Women's clothes are also designed to signify the wearer's distinction, even when a deceptive simplicity is in vogue. Such dresses as this, about 1805, don't last half a day without washing and pressing, which implies that there's always somebody in the background ready to perform these services. In other words, that one can afford to employ labour. Moreover, the smartest women wore muslin in all weathers and the lightest of footwear because being classical in the style of this room and everything in it called for a pretence that one was a goddess. When the cold became unbearable, they draped themselves in cashmere, scarves and shawls, imported at great trouble and expense from India. French and British shawls were only just beginning to compete with the valuable Indian ones, and even they were an item of considerable luxury. The big shawl takes a great deal of management and is tiresome to anyone doing manual work, so of course that fashion had a very long run indeed. If freedom is allowed by fashion in one direction, it will be restricted in another. For example, the 1830s. The skirt is reasonably long and not so wide as to be an encumbrance, but the sloping shoulders make it difficult to raise the arms. The fastening is at the back and has to be done up by somebody else. And the fantastic hairstyle calls for a hairdresser's skill and is so easy to disarrange. Everything announces, I don't have to do anything for myself. I have people to wait on me. Here's another way of telling the world, quite untruthfully perhaps, that you're one of the privileged few, the few who have no need to bother about the daily usefulness of the clothes they buy. This is the 1910 way. A simple little dress, but one in which you can't raise your arms very far. A hat pinned to the hair with several long hat pins. That shows you don't have to face wind and weather. A skirt in which you're only supposed to take tiny steps, suggesting that you're not obliged to do any serious walking. Or take this, if ever fashion went to an extremity, it was on the verge of the First World War, 1913 and 1914. Perhaps in the whole collection at the Museum of Costume there's never been a more anti-practical type of ball dress than the one with the fishtail train. It was every woman's ambition to look slinky, and the skirts were shaped to impede the natural stride. It was a train that couldn't even be picked up and carried. With deliberate perverseness, it was generally made in some very light colour and fragile material, carefully ensuring that the dress wouldn't last long. The craving for the plumage of rare birds caused some species to become almost extinct.